Government business, order of the day number 2, National Broadband Network Companies Amendment, Commitment to Public Ownership Bill 2024, resumption of debate on the second reading.
Thank you. So the question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the member for Mallee.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, talk about fake news. Who knew that this Labor government would introduce their own misinformation bill? In fact, their second attempt, yet here, they are, through this debate, spreading misinformation about some alleged secret plan that nobody on this side of the House even knows about, that the NBN will be privatised. How ironic. These are amendments to the government's own legislation introduced on the 25th of November 2010, when the Prime Minister was in Cabinet as the then Infrastructure Minister, where he introduced the bill saying that, and I quote, sets out arrangements for the eventual sale of the Commonwealth's stake in the company once the NBN rollout is complete, including provisions for independent and parliamentary reviews prior to any privatisation, and for Parliament to have the final say on the sale. So there it is, Deputy Speaker. Labor set up the NBN for privatisation, not the coalition, which his debate now asserts. This is an attempt at wedge politics, but Labor have ended up wedging themselves. Days earlier, the then Communications Minister, Stephen Conroy, had confirmed privatisation was on the agenda and highlighted that rural and regional areas would need to be front and centre of the sale. This is the same former Communications Minister who had only months earlier in 2010, with pomp and ceremony, came to my hometown in my electorate of Mallee and declared Mildura to be the first in the nation to switch off analogue television and switch on digital television. That was a great announcement. However, on July 1 this year, Mildura had the indignity of being the first to switch off digital television. So maybe Labor is wary that their 14-year itches are starting to scratch, having let down rural and regional Australians in my electorate at the 14-year mark. Maybe they realise they need to protect rural and regional Australia from themselves and add extra safeguards to prevent the sale of the NBN. Who knows? In my electorate of Mallee, I am pleased to say a new NBN presence is being established in Sea Lake, which I know constituents locally have been waiting patiently for and hopefully will come online in December. Robert Graham is one of those in Sea Lake, and he says, and I quote, "An NBN rollout is great once it is live because it brings the rest of us in line with the rest of the country. It opens us up to do the things we have not been able to do. At the moment, we are on ADSL Sky Muster, and if you use that, you have a latency issue, whereas the fibre removes our latency issues. If you are on ADSL, you are bandwidth restricted, but fibre opens up the restrictions, which mean things like telehealth and downloading and streaming all become a viable option." And I might say, Deputy Speaker, that most Australians can enjoy those, I won't even call them privileges, those services. Healthcare is a service. I note that the local Progress Association, Advanced Sea Lake Inc., are looking forward to that service being upgraded. I also understand, after advocating for local residents, that the transition from satellite to fixed wireless in Warraneen South will begin in the second half of 2025. I'm currently investigating NBN outages at Matoa that a local resident complained about at a recent stall I ran at Matoa's big weekend. My constituent says these outages happen without warning. A bit like power, really. But as I discussed recently with the NBN representative, this may come down to a retailer's failure to act on warnings that the NBN as a wholesaler provides to them. This is probably a sticking point with the NBN that many consumers don't understand, that their choice of retailer may be having an impact on their awareness of NBN outages. Of course, if the outages weren't happening in the first place, there would be less cause for consternation. Under the watch of this Prime Minister and the Communications Minister, Labor have overseen a major decline in the NBN, and maybe Australians aren't aware of this. They have hammered Australians with massive NBN price increases. We've seen 6 million families smashed by NBN price rises of up to 14% since October last year. Australians were dealt with a double whammy of higher internet costs, with 2 price hikes in the space of just 8 months since the Albanese Government backed a new pricing deal for NBN last year. And what did the Minister for Communications say? Infamously, she described these price rises as great news for consumers. I'm not sure how you work that out. Under Labor, the satellite business is collapsing. 2 years ago, the NBN had more than 120,000 satellite customers, and Starlink had virtually none. Today, the NBN is down to 85,000 satellite customers, and Starlink has more than 270,000. I might be one of them. The government's response? Convene a roundtable meeting. This government has never met a roundtable they didn't like. Over the same time period, the NBN's brownfields business, meaning existing homes, has lost almost 100,000 customers. And at the same time, the NBN's cash losses have blown out. For the most recent financial year, its net cash flow was minus $1.4 billion to minus $300 million, worse than the minus $1.1 billion result in the previous year. It is intriguing that Labor is so determined to keep the NBN in public hands, and I emphasise again, we on this side are not talking about changing that position. But when it comes to nuclear energy, Labor opposes our plan for 7 publicly owned nuclear power plants at existing coal-fired power plant sites across Australia. Labor have instead gone to a Labor-dominated inquiry here in Parliament into the prospects for nuclear energy in Australia instead, but that inquiry in this bill tell you it is Labor who have thrown positivity out of the window. We know their election slogan, thanks to the pomp and ceremony in Adelaide on the weekend, building Australia's future. The future, according to Labor, will be built on fear. Fear about nuclear energy, fear of phantom privatisations. That's Labor's positive vision for the future. When you campaign on fear, what you're doing is demonstrating how small your vision for the future really is. You pull down your opponent with fear tactics so nobody notices how small your vision really is. We now have a government more focused on countering the opposition's policies, governing from opposition, if you like, rather than their own. They're so desperate they've dusted off the old chestnut of going a step towards university education being free. That's what their thought bubble of 20% debt forgiveness for help debt means. You're 1/5 of the way to your university education being free. Many constituents who are old enough to remember say this Albanese government is worse than Whitlam's, and they're right. Now Labor are diving 50 years back into the history books for other ideas to out-Whitlam Whitlam. I remind those opposite that the Whitlam government was a one-term government. Be careful where you take your inspiration from.